Good evening, everyone, and welcome to SocialFlight Live. I'm Jeff Simon. We have a fantastic show for you this evening. Mike Busch is here, the CEO of Savvy Aviation. We are going to talk about all sorts of ways of saving you money as aircraft owners. Before we get started, as always, a couple of notes. First of all, I'm very excited to say that from what we are seeing on SocialFlight.com and the free SocialFlight mobile apps, there are tons of live in-person real fly-ins restarting all across the country. It's very, very exciting to see. And so I would always encourage all of you to go and check those out. They're available again on SocialFlight.com, the email that you can get if you sign up that will send you all sorts of local events and destinations, everything happening out there for you. Great things to do. And so it's wonderful to see those in-person events restarting. In addition to that, they've got a lot of new exciting happenings. This panel behind me going together, this is the mock-up, but we'll show you how we turn it into a real panel on the T-51 Mustang that's here behind me, getting built here in our home and our aircraft manufacturing facility out here near Boston. And also we have a winner of our Lightspeed Zulu 3 as part of SocialFlight's Fly to Win Challenge, Brian Metler. So congratulations to Brian. We have a new challenge that's now started. And so if you get the app and you go out there and fly and check in, you can win a whole prize pack of maintenance stuff for your aircraft from Tempest Aero. Check that out. So many cool things. Lastly, tonight's broadcast will be recorded. It'll be available on our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search for SocialFlight. One word, SocialFlight on YouTube. That'll bring you to our channel. You can see the show if you want to catch up on anything that Mike said, any other details, and that's also where we keep the videos of our SocialFlight's T-51 Mustang build. You can also put in any questions that you have for tonight's show in our Q&A feature. Just go and type that in. We won't be going direct in most cases. I'll try to fit them in to my conversation. So with that, I would like to introduce Mike. Mike is arguably the best known A&P and IA in general aviation. He founded Savvy Aviation in 2008 to provide aircraft maintenance, management, and consulting services to thousands of aircraft owners. They do pre-buy management, innovative engine monitor analysis, 24/7 breakdown assistance, Q&A services. There's a whole bunch of different services he offers, and we'll cover that at the end of the show. It's essentially AAA for GA and has so many services. Mike has authored hundreds of articles, 4 books on aircraft ownership and maintenance, and tonight he is here, as I bring him online, to talk about how to save you money with your aircraft maintenance. Welcome, Mike. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, Jeff. Sorry about the mess in the background, but
that's okay. You know, I love that you and I are old school here, right? If there is something in the background here, we're rolling up our sleeves and doing it. You can turn around and reach it. It's not like an image.
I was looking at that T-51 panel. I was thinking, boy, that looks expensive. But now you said it's just a mock-up. It's all pictures, huh?
Oh, come on. I got the real one right behind me here.
Okay. That looks expensive.
Well, one way or another, everything in aviation's expensive.
Yep.
So while we're talking money, let's start talking about saving people money. And I thought a great place to start the conversation would be where everyone meets their mechanic, whether they like it or not, once a year at the annual. And so give us a few tips about what the annual really entails and how going into it, an aircraft owner can set the stage for being really thoughtful about what maintenance happens and what control they have over it.
Well, that was quite a segue, by the way. You know, I think probably the most important thing to understand about an annual inspection is that it's an inspection. The purpose of an annual is not to fix your airplane. The purpose of an annual is to inspect your airplane and make an airworthiness determination. It's kind of like a medical for the airplane. You know, with medical certificates, we're supposed to go see an AME, you know, once every 2 years, once every 5 years, depends on how old you are. And the rest of the time, we self-certify ourselves. Well, airplanes work the same way. 364 days a year, the pilot in command is responsible for determining that the aircraft is airworthy. And then 1 day a year, we have to ask an IA to render a professional opinion. But the annual inspection is the purpose of it is not to fix the airplane, it's to determine whether there are any airworthiness discrepancies, whether the airplane complies with all of the airworthiness requirements, and to produce a list of any discrepancies that are found. And then the owner's job is to decide what to do about those things. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, that's not the way owners operate. They tell the shop, well, fix anything you find, and then all the decision making gets transferred from the owner to the mechanic. Mm-hmm. And often, the owner finds out about what got fixed when he sees the invoice, and then he's mad at the mechanic. So we have to try to change that dynamic, and annual inspection is not supposed to be a carte blanche to fix anything that you find wrong.
Right, that makes sense. And I really like your comparison of it to the medical, because I like, because also, you go into your AME when you have to go do that physical, and the one thing that always is kind of an eye roll thing is this may be a doctor, but they are not there to make you healthy. Like, they're not, right. Their job has nothing to do with fixing it. They probably won't even talk to you about that. They're just there inspecting you.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing. It seems like going into your annual inspection, there are two things, and some of this comes, of course, because you and I work together also, from the way that you run Savvy. It seems like there's really two sides to it. One is making sure that you and the mechanic are speaking the same language about inspection versus repair. But the other is this topic you mentioned of what's airworthiness and what isn't. What would you advise people in terms of having that early conversation before you get started, so that their mechanic themselves is differentiating those things?
Well, of course, airworthiness is an interesting concept. There are two components to airworthiness. For something to be airworthy, it has to comply with its type design. In other words, it has to meet specs, and it has to be in condition for safe flight. The first part of that, the first of the two bullets, is theoretically an objective standard. You find out whether something complies with its type design using a micrometer or something, or a compression tester, or it's some objective standard. Is the brake disc below the minimum allowable thickness? Is the cylinder compression below the minimum allowable value? That sort of thing. It's not really so much a mechanic's opinion. It's an objective standard. The other part of airworthiness, which is conditioned for safe flight, is a completely subjective standard. There's no definition of that. It's every IA has his own idea about what's safe and what isn't, and IAs theoretically shouldn't disagree as to whether something complies with its type design, but they always disagree on whether it's in condition for safe flight. That's a totally subjective standard. So, one common example is, we all know that as Part 91 operators, non-commercial operators, we're not required to comply with things like engine TBOs and prop TBOs and so on. But there are IAs out there who don't want to sign off an annual if you have a engine or a prop over TBO. Now they can't. They can't not sign off the annual because it doesn't comply with type design, because TBO is not part of the type design. TBO is just a suggestion by the manufacturer. but they have it in their head that it's not safe to fly beyond TBO. So they say it's not airworthy because they don't think it's safe. So if you have an engine that's at or over TBO and it's time for an annual, it really would pay for you to have a discussion with an IA before you ask him to do the annual, saying, hey, I've got an engine, it's 200 hours past TBO, it's running great, I really don't want to do anything to it, and unless you find some good reason that it's sick, but it sure doesn't seem sick to me. Do you have a problem with that? And if the IA says, yeah, I kind of have a problem with that, I can't really not comfortable signing off an annual on an airplane with an engine 200 hours over TBO, then you say thank you very much and find another IA.
Yeah.
It's a lot more difficult if you have that conversation halfway through the annual when your airplane's all in pieces and the IA says, oh, well, by the way, we're going to have to send this engine to an engine shop because it's over TBO.
Right.
That's not a fatal situation. There are ways to get out of it, but it's certainly an uncomfortable situation. So it makes a lot of sense to have a chat with the IA before you hire him to do the annual.
That makes a lot of sense.
That you're on the same page as far as maintenance philosophy is concerned.
Yeah, and it seems like that, we always think about that in terms of engine TBO, and then sometimes one layer beyond that to prop TBO. But I mean, I've always advocated to the folks that I advise that everyone should have a spreadsheet that has all of the major times of major components compared to maybe what they're what their manufacturer's recommendations are, whether that be mags, alternator, and a gearbox for like Bonanza gear, motors, all these types of things, to have an idea as to where you are in these hours. And that is it seems like that would be an awfully quick discussion if you have all that before you engage a shop to say, hey, here's where I am on all these things, and I don't have any problems with any of them. I mean, I'm fine with it. How are you before I start working with you?
Yeah, and it's important to understand that the maintenance manuals and instructions for continuing airworthiness, if you have STC items, they're chock full of maintenance intervals that say you should do this every 50 hours and that every 100 hours and that once a year and that every 5 years. And all of those are mere suggestions. None of them are requirements. As Part 91 operators, we don't have to pay any attention to those things. If you're a Part 135 operator, it gets a little bit more complicated. But as Part 91 operators, those things are just mere suggestions. And right. If you do comply with all of those manufacturers' recommendations, your maintenance costs are going to be very high. And you don't do that sort of thing, with your car. You don't overhaul the engine on your car every 100,000 miles. You only do it when it needs it. And right. We're allowed to do that as Part 91 operators. We can do everything on condition. We don't have to pay any attention to all of those times in the book. But if you leave it up to your mechanic, he's going to do it by the book. That's how mechanics are trained. They're trained to do everything by the book. So that's why it's really important for owners to be tightly in the decision loop during an annual inspection.
Yeah.
Rather than say handing over the keys and the credit card and say, call me when you're done. That's which happens an awful lot.
And I think I agree with that completely. That makes a lot of sense when you're talking, especially like we said about like, hey, if you can see all these key times up front and have that discussion, because some of them, I'd say probably the majority fit into what you just said. I'm a huge follower of that, of TBOs not necessarily something you should be following all the time. Some of them are a logical discussion. It makes a lot of sense if the mechanic's going to say, yeah, I understand that, the gear motor, your electric gear motor on this Bonanza is, we haven't been overhauling it, but all you've been doing is putting in brushes for 3,000 hours. You really need to think about this. So there's different levels. But one of the things I'd like to talk about is you've very, very rightly so always preached about that when you do that, you're not always gaining ground when you go and you adhere to a TBO, because you're introducing risk from the maintenance involved if you take a known component and then all of a sudden work on it.
Right. I mean, one of the really important concepts in maintenance is the notion of invasiveness. Some maintenance is relatively non-invasive, and the risk of doing it is relatively low, and some maintenance is very invasive. Taking an engine apart is like open heart surgery. That there are just a million ways that it can go back together wrong. And so we tend not to do surgery unless there's a really compelling reason and a very careful risk reward analysis that says, well, what benefit do I get out of doing this, and what would happen if I don't do it? And we agonize over things like that. Well, we need to have that same mindset when we're talking about invasive maintenance. In our practice, and we're managing the maintenance of well over 1,000 airplanes with shops all over the country, and we find that mechanics tend to be very spring-loaded to the take it apart position. There's a cylinder with low compression. They want to pull the cylinder off. There's a little metal in the oil filter. They want to tear down the engine. And owners have to resist that, because it's a gross overreaction, and it's a very expensive overreaction. And it's kind of easy for a mechanic to say you need to overhaul your engine, because the mechanic's not paying for it. It's actually generating revenue for him, if you want to be cynical about it. But that's really a decision that the owner should be making, not the mechanic. Mechanics have opinions about that, and it's fine for the mechanic to offer advice to the owner, but the owner has to be the decision maker.
You had a case recently you were talking to me about that had to do with finding a problem having to do with alternator couplings that, the same kind of thing.
Oh yeah, we had that. I think that happened just this couple of days ago, where we had a client that put his airplane in, I think it was a Cirrus SR22, went into a shop for an annual, and the mechanic pulled the alternator off to do a 500-hour torque check on the elastomeric drive coupling, and he found some pieces of elastomer, basically artificial rubber. It's kind of red rubbery stuff, and he found some chunks missing from the drive hub. Well, of course, obviously he wants to put a new drive hub on the alternator, but he says, well, where did that elastomer go? It's somewhere in the engine. We're going to need to tear the engine down. Well, that's ridiculous. So you think, well, what are the consequences of that elastomer coming loose and falling into the oil pan? Well, there's only two possibilities. It's either lying in the oil pan, in which case you just flush it out with some solvent, or at worst, it got trapped in the suction screen at the bottom of the oil pickup tube. And if there's enough of it on there, it might be providing some sort of obstruction and making it harder for the oil pump to pump oil. I've seen a couple of cases where suction screens got pretty infested with this elastomer when it comes apart. So there's an easy way to back flush that oil pickup tube. There's just a little plug you take off on the back of the engine. You force some solvent in, and it cleans out anything that's stuck on the pickup tube. And then you flush it out with solvent. But tearing down the engine is ridiculous.
Right.
You know, it makes no sense. It's a tremendous overreaction. But
And one of the things
the owner would have gone ahead with it, you know, if we hadn't stepped in and said, hey, you know, don't let them do that. That's wrong.
something that should have been in the you know, sub $1,000 winds up being $50,000 or
Yeah,
something like
exactly.
that.
Exactly.
And I think one of the things also is like we were saying before, you're not guaranteed to be moving to a place of more safety and more stability if you tear everything apart and redo it in that case. New parts have an infancy failure, infancy mortality.
Right. Right. I mean, I've got an interesting study that I often put up on, you know, in PowerPoint slides and stuff that was an analysis that was done of 5 years of General Aviation accidents, NTSB accident data, where they looked at all the accidents that were where engine failure was either the primary cause or a contributing factor to the accident. And then we looked at how many hours were on the engine in those various accidents. And they were heavily skewed to the low time end. In other words, almost all of the failures occurred with young engines, not old ones.
Right.
For exactly the reason that you said, Jeff. There are infant mortality issues when you put an engine together.
Yeah.
And most people have an intuitive feeling for this. If you know, if somebody gave you a brand new airplane, just came out of the factory, you know, had 10 hours on the airplane and said, we'd like you to ferry this to Europe. You know, most ferry pilots would say, well, you know, I'd feel a lot better if we put 100 or 150 hours on this airplane before I take it across the pond, you know, just make sure that it's solid. And that's exactly the right instinct, you know,
Right.
because young engines are at risk. So overhauling an engine or tearing down an engine for that matter, when you don't have to, is just, you know, putting yourself into a high risk zone for a while.
Mm-hmm.
It
And I
doesn't
think
make sense to do that if you don't have to. That's not even counting the fact that it's very expensive to do it.
right.
But
And I've seen the
even
same
if it
thing on
was free, it wouldn't be a good idea
exactly.
to do it when you don't have to.
Yeah, I had a flow divider fail in one case. It was like leaking on an engine, and perfect example. Sent it out, had it overhauled, came back, and it lasted less than 50 hours.
Mm.
And the previous one was there for 2 decades. So it's not like in that case had to do it because it had failed, but it's not like the act of overhauling this somehow guaranteed me the comfort of 20 more years. It ended up guaranteeing me the comfort of 2 months. So
and
I couldn't
and getting it re-overhauled at a different place probably too.
exactly. Or this one doing it locally. I said, send me the diaphragm.
Yeah.
The another thing, you know, some people have asked questions. The word mandatory gets thrown around a lot and either misinterpreted or simply intimidating people into things. Mandatory times for things. Again,
Right.
for Part 91, can you explain that not really being a thing?
Yeah, there's a very important concept, and this, by the way, this concept isn't true worldwide, but it's true in the U.S. If you have an airplane that's maintained under FAA rules, no aircraft owner has the right to tell no manufacturer has the right to tell an aircraft owner what he has to do to his airplane maintenance wise, or how often he has to do it. Only the FAA does. So if the manufacturer puts in section 5 of the maintenance manual, you need to change the spark plugs every 100 hours, for example. You don't have to do that.
Right.
if the FAA issued an AD requiring spark plugs to be changed every 100 hours, you'd have to do it.
Right.
If
So
you have
airworthiness
a
directives are,
relatively new airplane that was certified under Part 23, it is possible that your maintenance manual has a chapter in it called airworthiness limitations. Older airplanes don't have that, but some of the newer airplanes like the Cirrus and the Diamond and stuff have an airworthiness limitation section. If a maintenance manual has the airworthiness limitation section, the airworthiness limitation section actually comes from the FAA. It's like an AD. It has to be done. It's non-negotiable. But everything else in the maintenance manual is a mere suggestion.
mm-hmm.
The same thing is true of instructions for continued airworthiness. If you modify your airplane with an STC, let's say you put a power flow exhaust on it or something, the power flow exhaust system comes with a document called Instructions for Continued Airworthiness, which for all intents and purposes is the maintenance manual for the exhaust system. You could almost think of it as a maintenance manual supplement for the STC, and the rules for instructions for continued airworthiness are the same as for a maintenance manual. A lot of mechanics think if it's in instructions for continued airworthiness, you got to do it, but that's not true. The only stuff in an ICA that you have to do is if the ICA has an airworthiness limitation section in it. And if so, you have to do the stuff in that section because that section comes from the FAA. The rest of it comes from the manufacturer. And manufacturers can't tell aircraft owners what to do. So it's a very important concept. Like I say, it's not true in a lot of countries other than the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some debate about whether it's true for SLSAs. That's kind of a raging debate because the SLSA rules, there are a bunch of contradictory decisions that have come out of FAA legal on that. Nobody really knows exactly where things stand with SLSAs. They're kind of new, and all of this dust has to settle out before we really know what the rules are, because there's some issues there.
Right.
Like, for example, does the owner of an SLSA have to overhaul his engine at TBO? That's there's one FAA legal decision that says yes, he does, and there's another one that it came after that that said no, he doesn't. And I've sort of brought this to FAA, the Office of General Counsel's attention, and said, you really ought to make up your mind about this. But so far they've not really resolved it. But for certificated airplanes, the rules are very, very clear.
So on the concept of when we look at, again, saving money, and we'll stay for a moment with the annual, what kind of language, or how can an owner talk to their shop about what is airworthiness on this whole list of discrepancies and what isn't? And I'll give you an example. We see tons of things where it's like steering too sloppy, and then it's like, here's a laundry list of all the work that they're going to do.
Well, again, something like steering too sloppy is one of these subjective condition for safe flight things. And if something like that comes up during an annual, you've got three choices. You can either accept the mechanic's opinion and let him do what he thinks needs to be done. You can try to negotiate with him if you disagree with it and think that it's fine, or it's always been like that as long as you've owned the airplane and it's not gotten any worse, and let's just leave well enough alone. Or if you feel strongly about it and you can't come to agreement with the mechanic, you can just agree to disagree and tell him, sign off the annual with a discrepancy, because you don't want to sign it off as airworthy without doing X, and I don't really want you to do X. So the way we're going to resolve this is you're going to sign off the airplane as unairworthy with a discrepancy, and give me a discrepancy list and give me an invoice, and I'll pay the invoice. I'll take my airplane back, and then I'll find somebody else to deal with this discrepancy, because you and I obviously aren't going to be able to agree on it.
Right.
That's kind of the get out of jail card. And
right.
We don't do that very often. I would say, you know, with managing 1,000 airplanes, doing 1,000 annuals a year, you know, maybe 3 or 4 times a year we wind up having to extract an airplane from a shop because the shop is being unreasonable and we can't convince them to do things in a reasonable fashion. But like that you know, the guy we were talking about that wanted to overhaul the engine because there was a missing elastomer somewhere, you know, that one is still ongoing discussion. But if the shop isn't willing to come around, you know, we're going to advise the owner to tell the shop to sign it off with a discrepancy. And then what does he have to do to make the airplane airworthy after he gets it out of this evil shop? He needs to find any old A&P and say, would you do a 100-hour inspection on my engine, which would take maybe 2 hours, and sign a logbook entry saying I've done a 100-hour inspection on the engine and I find it in airworthy condition. And that clears the discrepancy and the guy's good to go.
Interesting. And so that clears the discrepancy even if there isn't a specific action that's been taken having to do with that.
Right. I mean, the second A&P that we're asking to do the 100-hour is going to look at the engine and say, I can't find anything wrong with it.
Right.
So
but is there any, I mean, we've always talked about the discrepancy list itself is provided to the aircraft owner. That's not technically part of the logbook.
That's right.
Does that have to be given to the second owner? The second mechanic, excuse me?
No, that discrepancy list is a memorandum from the IA who's doing the inspection to the owner, and saying, I just did an annual inspection on your airplane. I found it unairworthy, and here are the things I found that were unairworthy. And he gives a discrepancy list to the owner, and what that discrepancy list means is everything that isn't on this list has been found airworthy. So this memo is your homework assignment. At this point, the IA is done, the annual is done. Don't have to do another annual for another year. But you've got an airplane with some documented discrepancies, and you deal with them like you would deal with any discrepancy. You'd go, you know, if the discrepancy happened to be that your tires are bald, you might even clear that discrepancy yourself, because it's changing a tire is something an owner is allowed to do. But you know, if the guy doesn't like your engine because he can't find a piece of missing elastomer, or because your engine is 200 hours over TBO, or because he woke up on the wrong side of the bed that morning, it doesn't matter. You know, you just say, okay, look, sign it off as a discrepancy, and I'll go find somebody else to inspect the engine and declare it airworthy. And of course, a 100-hour on an engine doesn't take very much time. It's, you know, it takes a couple hours.
Does that same thing apply to a 100-hour on the entire aircraft afterwards? I mean, does not to be nitpicky, but can the discrepancy list, does it have to go to the next mechanic if you have things that are deemed to be subjective and areas of conflict?
You could do that, but that would be kind of extreme. In other words, if you had an annual signed off with a discrepancy, you could take it to somebody else and say, do a 100-hour on the whole airplane, and sign it off and ask him to sign it off as airworthy. But you know, a 100-hour inspection on an airplane is essentially the same thing as an annual on an airplane. It's a lot of work.
Right, but I'm wondering, you talked about engine-specific stuff, and what I'm wondering from some questions people are asking is, for example, if the area that you're debating let's say again we're back down to some form of something being having more play in it than they're comfortable with, or something like that. That's a problem. Then can you do the same process? Can you take it to someone else who isn't going to have this problem and have them essentially redo it?
Right, but in the case of an airframe item, you would probably just say, ask them to deal with a particular thing. The rollers, the rollers on the yoke are sloppy. Would you inspect them, please, and give me an inspection entry?
Oh, okay.
Inspected
So you
this
could be
item.
specific with the second person,
Yeah,
to clear that. So take something like a gear-related item, or someone doesn't like something going on with retractable gear, which could go way into the thousands. And there's a total disagreement whether or not that really is legitimate. You could take it to the second person and say, can you look at all this and put a logbook entry in? They look,
sure.
they inspect, they put a logbook entry and say, we think it's fine.
Yeah, if you go take a pilot check ride and you flunk some item on the list, you don't have to retake the whole check ride, right? You can just retake the stuff that you messed up. Well, this is kind of the same situation.
Right.
I mean, the reason I suggested that you would ask somebody to do a 100-hour inspection on the engine because of the elastomer you can't find is because you can't find it. It's
Right.
It's not like a discrepancy where you could say that thing is bad. It's like, I think there must be something floating around the engine, but I can't find it. That's a funny discrepancy. So the best way to clear that is probably to just do a 100-hour inspection on the engine.
Right. So how do you clear something when someone has a problem that's not measurable? That's like, I'm not signing off a gearbox that's 3 times past its TBO or whatever, something we all and you universally agree owners shouldn't have to deal with. But how do they clear the discrepancy afterwards? If it's just opinion based on hours or something.
Well, you get somebody to do an inspection of it and sign an entry saying, I've inspected this and find it airworthy.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense, certainly.
I mean, sometimes it's not airworthy. Sometimes you've got to fix it, and you're arguing over what the fix is going to be. Are we going to do a $20,000 fix or a $500 fix? Okay.
Right.
Sometimes you're just arguing over whether there's an airworthiness discrepancy at all or not.
Right.
So
let's talk about that for a minute, because the term overhaul, not just on engines, on anything, on components, on props, mechanics love that term, right? We're just going to overhaul it. And facilities that do the component work, prop shops, component shops, they love that term. Tell us about the other options people have, and the key word there for people, IRANs.
Yeah, that's also a really important concept for owners to understand, that if something doesn't work, you don't necessarily have to overhaul it. You can just fix what's broken, and that's called a repair. And the term of art that we typically use for it is IRAN, which stands for inspect and repair as necessary. One of the best examples that I can think of that illustrates the point in sort of the extreme, the KCS 55 HSI, the venerable King HSI. It's a very expensive instrument to repair, to overhaul. Very expensive. It's very complicated. It's 10 pounds of stuff in a 5-pound sack, really. But the KCS 55 has a habit of the little glide slope bugs that appear when you're shooting an ILS, and then they sort of disappear behind a screen when you're not receiving a glide slope. Those bugs have a tendency to stick. They're driven by a mechanical meter and they have a tendency to stick. And sticky glide slope bugs are a pretty serious problem, you know, because if you're trying to shoot an ILS and the bugs are sticky, you might break out and see a windshield full of rocks or something. So you got to do something about it. And the thing that most people do about it is they take the KCS 55 and send it off to an instrument shop and ask them to overhaul it. And it comes back, you know, with a $4,000 bill for the overhaul. But you don't have to do that. You can send it to an instrument shop and say, fix the sticky glide slope bug. And then it'll come back with a $500 invoice or a $300 invoice because they didn't overhaul it. They just fixed what was bad about it. The thing about overhaul is one of these magic words in maintenance. When you ask somebody to overhaul something, you take away all of their discretion.
Right.
They have to do everything that it says in the overhaul manual. They have to replace all sorts of parts unconditionally, even if they don't need replacing. They have to measure everything else to see whether it's in service limits. So overhauls are very expensive. And a lot of the time, that's not really what we want done. We just want to fix what's broken. We don't want to mess with the rest of the stuff. And there's a lot of stuff in a KCS 55 besides those glide slope bugs. So, you know, that's an example. I guess it's a little dated example because we're rapidly phasing out the KCS 55s and putting all glass instruments in. But
it's a great example. It's a great example. And you know, it seems like there are a very small number of components where the word overhaul has a dollar value to the resale and value of the aircraft, like the engine and when that was overhauled, the prop. Probably not much else, but there's a very, very short list of those things where there's some marketing value.
And another thing when that subject comes up, Jeff, is I always ask the owner, I said, are you planning to sell the airplane in the foreseeable future? If you aren't, if you plan to keep it for a while, then you don't care what its fair market value is. Don't worry about that until, you know, until you start thinking about selling it, then you can worry about stuff like that. But if you're planning to
well, that's
keep the
perfect on a
airplane,
prop,
you don't
right?
really
You pull off a controllable 3-blade prop, the shop will tell you, here's price 1 for inspect and repair as necessary. Here's price 2, which is perhaps double that to call it an overhaul. And you can ask them, and sometimes I've been through this, and they've said, well, when it comes back to you, IRAND, it's got the same shelf life for you. There's no difference in that, but it is different in the number of components we're going to have to deal with if you want it called an overhaul and you want a logbook change.
Right. Well, you know, the prop's a very good example because if you think about a prop, I'm thinking about a controllable pitch propeller. It consists of two parts. It's kind of like an engine has a hot section, a cold section. A prop has blades and a hub. The blades are out there where you can look at them. It's easy to inspect the blades. You know whether the blades are okay or not. You know if you hit a rock or or they're not tracking right or whatever. But the hub is a black box. You know, all the stuff in the hub you can't see. There's no way to inspect it without taking it apart. So when you send a prop off to a prop shop, and first of all, I don't particularly believe in sending a prop off to a prop shop unless there's a really compelling reason, because in 50 years of reading NTSB accident reports, I have yet to hear of an accident that was caused by a high time propeller. I've heard of some accidents where propellers came off the airplane, but that wasn't the propeller's fault. That was the fault of whoever it is who torqued down the nuts that secure it to the flange. But you can send a prop off for an overhaul, in which case they do a whole lot of stuff to the blades and they do a whole lot of stuff to the hub. Or you can send it to a prop shop and say, I just want to do a resale repair, in which case they basically do the same stuff to the hub as they would have done if it was an overhaul, but they leave the blades alone.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, you don't need the prop shop to inspect the blades normally, and unless the prop's been in some kind of a mishap. You and your IA can look at the blades. They're just sitting out there, and you can see if they're okay or not. So you don't really need the prop shop to mess with that stuff.
Right.
And the difference in cost between an overhaul and a resale repair is typically about 2 to 1. The resale repair is typically about half as much.
Yeah.
If the prop is de-iced and has de-icing boots on the blades, it's even more. The differential is even more, because in an overhaul they have to strip off all that de-icing stuff, and then they have to put new ones back on, because when you take them off, you take them off destructively.
Right. And I would like to ask you, when it comes, and a prop is a great example, that you know, there are times when looking at something, even if there isn't something dramatic, does still save you money in the long run. For example, I had a situation with a prop where when it went into the shop, their answer was they had to mill out the grooves oversized for the for snap rings, et cetera, due to corrosion, and basically said, hey, we caught it in time, we could just do this, and the cost ended up being pretty low. But if you do let something go beyond a certain point, you may wind up not having certain tools at your disposal that leads to the shop. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not sure I completely understood the scenario, Jeff. I'm sorry.
So there, you know, prop shops and others sometimes will tell you that there are certain cases where if you really don't ever send it in to be inspected until you wait for a failure, that you can have things progress beyond where they have approved repairs, and you can wind up being in a bigger. What do you see that at all playing in?
I mean, I've heard that said often on engines, that gee, if you run the engine, you know, way past TBO, then when it comes time to overhaul it, it's going to be way more expensive. That's not true. That's just flat not true.
Mm-hmm.
All of the components in the engine that wear get replaced at overhaul. So it doesn't matter how much you wear them or how little you wear them. I mean, that's the problem with overhaul. If they take your engine apart at overhaul and all the bearings look perfect, they have to replace the bearings anyway.
Right.
You know, they have to replace the exhaust valves. They have to replace, there's a whole long laundry list of stuff they have to replace regardless of condition. So you could almost use that argument the other way. You know, if I'm going to spend all this money on an overhaul, I might as well get my money's worth. Let's get this, take this engine as far as we could possibly take it before we overhaul.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Now, on the TBO versus IRAN side, do you recommend the IRAN approach to all the different components, like magnetos, or, you know, alternator?
No, I mean, there's some components that you can't do that with, and you know, the magneto is a perfect example. A magneto is is pretty much a black box. We don't have any way of determining its condition without taking it all apart. We can't look at an oil filter. We can't stick a borescope in it. We can't, you know, we just don't have any tools. With engines, we have tons of tools. And they're non-invasive tools, and we can use them all. We can have a really good feeling for the condition of the engine. But magnetos are really a black box. You can't tell what's going on. And magnetos have a number of components in them that have a high probability of failure. Things like distributor gears and stuff, because they're made out of plastic. And magnetos also have components that wear internally, that you can't even see without taking the thing apart. You know, carbon brushes and felts that are pre-lubricated, and you know, just a whole bunch of stuff. Magnetos are horrible. I would love to see them all go away and go to totally electronic ignition. But the magneto is a perfect example of something that we have no choice but to do on time, because we have no real way to do it on condition. But magnetos are kind of the exception to the rule. The vast majority of things on our airplanes we can do on condition, because there are practical ways of determining condition that are non-invasive. But there's some things like magnetos that where we can't do that, and so we have to do it on a time basis.
But when you open up a magneto, do you recommend to people that they do IRAN or that they do overhaul?
IRAN for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the only difference between an IRAN and an overhaul, for a magneto, for example, if you send a magneto to a shop and ask them to do a $500 IRAN, which is what I always recommend doing, they replace the components that, in their opinion, need to be replaced. If you tell them to do an overhaul, they have to replace all the components that some guy who wrote the book would say need to be replaced, that have nothing to do with the actual condition of those components. That's why an overhaul is more expensive, because it involves doing things that don't need to be done. Whereas an IRAN, you're giving the technician who's doing it discretion to repair as necessary. That's what the IRAN stands for, rather than repair unconditionally, which is really what an overhaul is.
You know, I asked a shop, I've asked several component shops, and I would encourage people to do it, to actually ask them what is the difference between the overhaul and the IRAN. And I've often found, whether it's magnetos or alternators or things like this, if you look at the list of what parts have to get replaced with the overhaul versus what is done normally with the IRAN, they are not generally things you care about. It's like, well, we have to replace all the screws and all the nuts.
Yeah.
Like, and how much does that cost? You're like $300. Like, what?
Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of stuff that is arbitrarily required at overhaul because it's in the book.
Mm-hmm.
You know, an overhaul kind of assumes worst case, that everything is trash, everything needs to be replaced. That's a bit of an overstatement, but it takes away a lot of discretion on the part of the guy who's doing the work. So,
are there any other types of things that kind of come to mind from all the work that you do with Savvy, of advice you'd give people just in the general category of, you know, if people just followed a few more things, they could save money if that were their goal, if that's what they needed to do, was be more budget conscious? Is there anything else that kind of comes to mind where the owner can get involved or can do a better job managing to save money?
Oh yeah, well, I was going to say I could write a book on that, but I already
I think
did,
you have.
actually. You know, the first thing is when you put the airplane in the shop, you have to make it clear what you're authorizing the mechanic to do and what you're not authorizing him to do. If you put it in for an annual, you're authorizing him to inspect the airplane and create a discrepancy list. And you should be telling him directly, I want you to inspect the airplane and create a discrepancy list, and then I want you to call me so we can go over it. I don't want you fixing anything while you're inspecting it. I don't want you ordering any parts. I just want you to make a discrepancy list, and then give me a write-up that says, here's everything I found, and here's what it's going to cost to fix each thing. Parts, labor, outside work. And then we'll sit down and talk about it and decide what to do and what not to do. And I might have some questions for you, like, you know, why do we have to do that, or what's worse that could happen if we didn't do that? You know, questions like that.
Yep.
But if you don't have that kind of agreement with the mechanic from the get-go, then he's going to assume that he has carte blanche to go fix anything he finds wrong, and then you as the aircraft owner are out of the decision loop, which is a bad situation, because if you leave all the decisions up to the mechanic, you're probably not going to be really happy with the result.
Probably not. You mentioned one way of extricating yourself from an annual, a couple ways actually. One, getting that discrepancy list and moving the airplane. Another one that you already mentioned having to do with that was getting someone else to re-inspect something on there. When an annual begins, can it be stopped if you have a discrepancy? You know, when you walk into it, you gave the AME example. When you walk into an AME and he starts that stuff with the FAA's online system, you're in. That's it.
Yeah.
Is it true? Is it the same with annual or not?
It's not as true. When an IA starts an annual, he is supposed to fix it, to complete it, but it's not it's not like the AME situation where he's compelled to complete it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because it's your airplane, so you can say, I want my airplane back now, you know.
Right, I'll pay you for
Write
your
up an
time.
invoice
I'll
for
pay
the
you for
time
your
you
time
put
and
in
we're
so
done.
far, you know. So an owner can terminate an annual in the middle, but I mean, I can't think of a case where we ever actually did that.
Okay.
What's more likely to happen is you get into an annual and there are just some things that you have disagreements about, and the first thing you do is you try to convince the mechanic to see it your way, or to compromise, or to do something where you can both get on the same page. If that doesn't work, the second step is usually to go try to get a second opinion from somebody who is an expert in whatever it is you're arguing about. If it's an engine thing, an engine expert. If it's you know, if it's a structural thing, then a structures expert. And then see if the expert agrees with you or agrees with your mechanic. If he agrees with your mechanic, you can just eat humble pie and say, look, I guess I was wrong. If he agrees with you, then get the expert to talk to your mechanic and see if he can convince your mechanic to change your mind. And if you get a real authority, like if you get somebody from the factory or whatever, then you got a pretty good chance of changing the mechanic's mind. And then if that doesn't work, you go to the final, the third step of the process, where you fire the IA. You basically say, look, we're not going to agree on this. Sign it off with discrepancy. Give me my airplane back. I'll deal with the discrepancies.
And then people can get a ferry permit if needed to get to another shop, whatever they need.
If necessary, you can get a ferry permit. And actually, most of the time, if you ask the mechanic to sign off the annual discrepancies and ask him if he would make the logbook entry necessary for you to get a ferry permit, the safe to fly logbook entry, unless the guy is a real SOB, he probably will be glad to do that for you, because I mean, think of the mechanic at this point. He wants you to get your airplane out of his shop and never darken his door again. And even more importantly, he wants to get paid. And and he knows the best way to get paid is to say, yeah, I'll help you get a ferry permit. I'd like you to take this airplane as far away from here as you possibly can. I don't want to deal with you or it anymore, because that's kind of where you are, because you've been trying and trying and trying to come to some agreement. You just can't do it at this point. The two of you can't stand one another anymore. And so, most of the time the mechanic will be happy to help you get a ferry permit. And unless it's some obviously terrible thing, like the wing's about to fall off or something. But all a mechanic is being asked to do in the process of getting a ferry permit is to say, this airplane is safe to fly for another 30 minutes, which is a very low standard. I mean, obviously the airplane is unairworthy, because otherwise you wouldn't need a ferry permit. But all you're really asking the mechanic to do at this point is to sign a logbook entry saying this airplane is safe to make the intended ferry flight, which is an extremely low standard. So you're really not asking much of the mechanic to ask him to do that.
Makes a lot of sense. And of course, as you mentioned earlier, there's also a lot of items that may show up on that list that an owner can deal with even themselves. If you separate it and you have a discrepancy list, I know I saw one recently that was something like over $1,000 in missing placards. And as soon as I made the owner aware that a piece of tape and a marker would
You can get a
save him
dime machine.
$1,000,
Yeah. Yeah.
he was thrilled. But put a bunch of tape and markers all over the plane and marker rating all over the plane, and he was airworthy.
And I think that's probably preventive maintenance. I think he's allowed to put those stickers on all by himself.
I believe he actually is. Yeah, they're pretty specific on that one. So, Mike, before we go, I want to make sure we also talk about the services that Savvy has to help people directly with this, because there's a ton of questions, of course, that have come in. And Savvy has services from Savvy QA all the way to you managing their aircraft. Tell us a little bit about how people can reach you and what services are offered.
Well, SavvyAviation.com is the place to go, both to find out about what we do and to get in touch with us. We have a variety of different services that we offer. Sort of the flagship service is Savvy MX, which is a full-blown maintenance management service where we basically stand in for you in dealing with shops and mechanics, and you know, we do all the stuff that owners are supposed to do, and it's our kind of our most powerful advocacy kind of service. Savvy QA is a consulting service. It's where we work with the aircraft owner. We give him advice, we give him second opinions, we give him shop recommendations, but we don't talk to his shop or mechanic. He does that. And we started that service because some owners just, you know, have a personal relationship with their mechanic, and they really don't want an intermediary. They just want advice, and some would prefer to have us handle it. So we will do it either way. We have a pre-buy service, which has absolutely exploded during this last year with the COVID lockdown and stuff. For some reason, a huge number of airplanes are changing hands, and our pre-buy service has gone up by about 500% over the last year. It's just kind of remarkable. But we set up and manage pre-buys. You know, it used to be easier because it used to be that most people would buy airplanes that were somewhere in the general geographic area that they were, and they could go drive and take a look at it and get involved in setting up the pre-buy personally. Now everybody buys their airplanes online, and you know, we have all these online marketplaces, and so owners frequently will find an airplane that they want to buy, but it's 2,000 nautical miles away, and the logistics get very difficult. So we offer a nationwide pre-buy management service. We work with hundreds of shops all over the country, and so that's the third of our services. One of the things that we do that I don't really think anybody else is doing is that we offer extremely sophisticated engine monitor data analysis. We have a whole division of the company devoted to doing analysis, both automated analysis. We've got machine learning algorithms and stuff that scan your engine monitor data looking for issues, and we also have a staff of professional analysts that will look at the data. And that service is called Savvy Analysis. And it probably represents third of our business. And then the most recent addition that we've just been doing for the last couple of years is the thing you mentioned, Savvy Breakdown, which is which is the AAA for GA. It's a 24/7 hotline that, you know, if you're away from home with your airplane and you run into a problem, any time of the day or night, you can call this hotline, and within 15 minutes, and it's usually more like 5, one of our IAs will be in touch with you and work through a diagnosis with you, figure out whether the problem you're having with your airplane is a safety of flight item, or, you know, whether it's okay to fly the airplane to either home or to the next destination on your itinerary, or to some place, a good place to get the airplane fixed, or whether you have to deal with it immediately, in which case we do whatever has to be done to get your airplane resolved. And you can either stay with your airplane, or you can go find alternate transportation, continue your trip, and we'll deal with the airplane and get it airworthy. We had one Cirrus that called us on the breakdown hotline. He'd landed his airplane on a little island in the middle of the Potomac that has, it's a little island. It's got a runway on it. There's absolutely no services, and he wound up screwing up the landing and seriously damaging his nose gear. And the only way to get to this thing, other than to fly into the runway, is by ferry boat. It's, you know, the logistics of fixing it were quite difficult. So we got the airplane patched up to where it could be flown, and then we ferried it to a place where proper repairs could be made, and so on. So, but that's the Savvy Breakdown service. It's
A lot of people
General Aviation.
getting help. A lot of people getting help from an awful lot of different services that you've got there. Well,
And
Mike,
actually the breakdown service is amazingly inexpensive for a single engine piston airplane like a Cirrus or something. It's less than $100 a year, so it's
Wow.
kind of a no-brainer.
yeah,
We just lowered the price.
there's not much that's less than $100 a year in the aviation
No.
world.
Not even hamburgers anymore, huh?
Exactly. Well, Mike, thank you so much for your time this evening. I really appreciate it. We have had you on a few times. We'll be continuing to have you on. We'll get to more people's questions in future episodes, and encourage everyone to go to savvyaviation.com and make sure that they check out all these different services where you can get your questions answered with Savvy QA, breakdown help, everything all the way up to the full boat with Savvy MX, and have someone help manage your aircraft for you and get the expertise that Mike provides through this company. So again, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
You bet. It's always a lot of fun, Jeff.
You're very, very welcome. And to everyone else out there, again, thank you for taking the time out of your evening to join us here on SocialFlight Live. Please join us again next week. We have Jack Pelton on. That's next week, May 25th, same time, same place. He'll be announcing all the different things happening with AirVenture 2021 coming back this year. Very exciting to be the venue that Jack's going to go announce that on. Following that on Tuesday, June 1st, we've got Sebastian Hines of Zenith Aircraft joining us, and an incredibly special show happening on June 8th. Admiral Lawrence Chambers of the USS Midway aircraft carrier will be here on the show as well. I would encourage all of you to go look him up, do a quick search on Admiral Lawrence Chambers, and that will tell you all you need to know about why that's a show not to miss. Until next time, thank you so much, Mike, for joining us, and I wish all of you blue skies.